What happens when Hollywood's most respected actor meets late-night television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when decades of pent-up frustration finally explode on live television. This is the story of how one interview spiraled completely out of control, ending with security being called and a legendary actor walking off set in disgust. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when Denzel Washington finally says what everyone in Hollywood has been thinking about Jimmy Kimmel. Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live started like any other, but within minutes, viewers witnessed something unprecedented. The tension was palpable from the moment Denzel Washington walked onto that stage. Something was different about his usual composed demeanor. There was an edge, a barely contained frustration that seemed ready to boil over at any moment. Kimmel, known for his provocative interviewing style and tendency to push boundaries for cheap laughs, appeared completely oblivious to the storm brewing across from him. As the interview began, what should have been standard promotional banter for Washington's latest film quickly devolved into something much more sinister. "So Denzel, you've been in this business for what, 40 years now?" Kimmel started with his trademark smirk. "Must be tough watching all these young actors come in and take roles that used to go to, more established performers." The comment hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Washington's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained controlled. "Jimmy, I think you're misunderstanding something fundamental about this industry. Talent doesn't have an expiration date." But Kimmel wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair with that familiar condescending grin that has become his signature. "Oh, come on, Denzel. We all know Hollywood has a shelf life, even for the great ones. I mean, when was your last really big hit? Training Day was what, over 20 years ago?" The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the playful ribbing they expected from a late-night talk show. This felt personal, calculated, and unnecessarily cruel. Washington's publicist, sitting in the green room, was already reaching for her phone. "You know what's interesting, Jimmy?" Washington's voice dropped to that dangerous quiet tone that anyone who's seen his films recognizes as the calm before the storm. "You sit here night after night, making jokes about people who've actually accomplished something with their lives. But what have you really contributed to the world besides cheap shots and manufactured controversy?" The studio audience fell silent. Even Kimmel's usually reliable laugh track seemed to malfunction. The host's smile faltered for just a moment before he doubled down, clearly not recognizing the precipice he was approaching. "Hey, that's pretty harsh coming from someone whose best days are clearly behind him," Kimmel shot back, his voice taking on that nasty edge that emerges when his ego feels threatened. "I mean, let's be honest here, Denzel. You're not exactly setting the box office on fire these days, are you?" That's when everything changed. Washington slowly placed his hands on the arms of his chair and leaned forward. The controlled facade was beginning to crack, and everyone in that studio could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Years of watching Kimmel tear down better people than himself for laughs had finally pushed one of Hollywood's most dignified actors to his breaking point. "You want to talk about setting things on fire, Jimmy?" Washington's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "Let's talk about how you've spent your entire career building yourself up by tearing others down. Let's talk about the real reason your ratings have been tanking." The camera operators exchanged nervous glances. This was spiraling far beyond anything they'd witnessed in years of taping. Kimmel's producers were frantically signaling from the wings, but the host was too deep in his own arrogance to recognize the danger signs. What happened next would change everything. But nobody in that studio was prepared for just how far this confrontation was about to go. Kimmel, either completely tone-deaf to the volatile situation he'd created or simply drunk on his own perceived power, decided to escalate things further. He leaned back in his chair with that insufferable smirk that has become his trademark and delivered what would prove to be the match that lit the fuse. Oh, come on, Denzel. Don't get all serious on me now. This is supposed to be fun. Maybe you're just getting a little too sensitive in your old age? Kimmel's voice dripped with condescension as he gestured dismissively. I mean, we're just having a conversation here. Can't handle a little friendly banter anymore? The audience could feel the shift immediately. Even Kimmel's most loyal fans in the crowd began to sense that their host had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. Washington's eyes narrowed, and for the first time in decades of interviews, America's most respected actor looked genuinely angry. Friendly banter? Washington's voice carried a dangerous edge that made everyone in the studio freeze. Jimmy, there's nothing friendly about what you just said, and there's nothing friendly about the way you've been conducting yourself tonight. But Kimmel, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the moment, pressed on with his attack. Look, I get it. Nobody likes getting older. Nobody likes watching their relevance fade. But that's just the business, right? Maybe it's time to accept that your moment has passed. The words hit the studio like a physical blow. Even the cameramen looked uncomfortable behind their equipment. Washington's publicist was now frantically trying to get the attention of the show's producers, but they seemed frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let this train wreck continue for the sake of ratings. My moment has passed, Washington repeated slowly, his voice dropping to that quiet intensity that had made him legendary on screen. Jimmy, my moment? I've been having moments for 4 decades. I've built a legacy that will outlast your entire career. What exactly is your legacy going to be? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Kimmel's face flushed red, his composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of Washington's unwavering stare. The host's usual arsenal of cheap jokes and deflecting humor suddenly seemed inadequate against the raw honesty of the moment. My legacy? Kimmel's voice took on a nastier tone, his mask of jovial host finally slipping completely. My legacy is that I've been entertaining people for years while you've been making pretentious movies that nobody watches anymore. At least I know my audience. That's when Washington stood up. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the slow, deliberate movement of a man who had reached the absolute limit of his patience. The studio audience gasped audibly. Even the band members stopped their casual tuning to watch what was unfolding. Your audience? Washington's voice was quiet but carried throughout the entire studio. Jimmy, your audience is shrinking every single night because they're tired of watching you tear down people who are better than you. They're tired of your mean-spirited jokes and your complete lack of respect for anyone who's actually accomplished something meaningful. Kimmel's face was now completely red, his carefully constructed persona crumbling in real time. You know what, Denzel? Maybe you should just stick to what you know, making movies for the 3 people who still care about your career. The insult was so petty, so deliberately cruel, that even Kimmel's own staff looked embarrassed. The audience had gone completely silent, many of them looking down at their phones, clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Washington took a step closer to Kimmel's desk, his presence filling the space between them. You want to know what I know, Jimmy? I know that you're a small, insecure man who's built his entire career on making other people feel as miserable as you clearly are inside. The words cut through the studio like a blade. Kimmel's mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water, clearly unprepared for this level of direct confrontation. His usual bag of tricks, the self-deprecating humor, the deflecting jokes, the fake vulnerability, all seemed useless against Washington's unflinching honesty. You sit here every night, Washington continued, his voice gaining strength, hiding behind your jokes and your writers and your laugh track, thinking that makes you untouchable. But what you really are is a bully with a platform, and tonight, your platform just became your downfall. The tension in the room was suffocating. Kimmel's band leader was frantically trying to get his attention, probably hoping to cut to commercial. But Kimmel seemed frozen in place, finally understanding that he had pushed the wrong person too far. But Washington wasn't finished. Not even close. And what he said next would ensure that this confrontation would be remembered as the moment Jimmy Kimmel's career began its final descent. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Jimmy?" Washington's voice carried across the silent studio, with the weight of absolute authority. "It's not that you're mean-spirited. It's not even that you lack talent. The real tragedy is that you had a platform to do something meaningful, and instead you chose to use it to diminish others because it made you feel bigger." Kimmel's mouth opened as if to respond, but Washington raised his hand, and the gesture was so commanding that even the host fell silent. The audience was transfixed, witnessing something they'd never seen before: a complete dismantling of everything Kimmel represented. Every night, millions of people tune in to watch you, and what do you give them? Cheap shots at people who've dedicated their lives to their craft. Mockery of anyone who dares to take themselves seriously. You've turned cynicism into currency, and you've gotten rich off other people's dignity. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of Kimmel's humiliation. His producers were in full panic mode now, but they were frozen between wanting to cut away and knowing they were witnessing television history. The ratings would be through the roof, even as their host's reputation crumbled in real time. Kimmel finally found his voice, but it came out as a desperate croak. "Hey, that's not fair, Denzel. I'm just doing comedy. People expect better." Washington's voice boomed across the studio, cutting Kimmel off mid-sentence. "They expect better than watching you systematically destroy anyone who threatens your fragile ego. They expect better than your pathetic attempts to stay relevant by tearing down people who've actually earned their place in this industry." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the usually supportive studio audience seemed to be holding their collective breath, many of them now openly uncomfortable with their host's behavior. Some were already reaching for their phones, undoubtedly preparing to share what they were witnessing with the world. Kimmel's face had gone from red to pale, sweat beading on his forehead as the full weight of the situation finally dawned on him. He tried to regain control, falling back on his default setting of dismissive arrogance, but his voice betrayed his desperation. "Look, Denzel, maybe you should just calm down a little bit. You're making this way more dramatic than it needs to be. We're supposed to be having fun here." That's when Washington's composure finally snapped completely. The carefully controlled anger that had been building throughout the interview erupted like a volcano, and what came next would be replayed millions of times across social media. "Fun?" Washington's voice rose to a level that made everyone in the studio flinch. "You think this is fun, Jimmy? You think destroying people's reputations for laughs is fun? You think making careers into punchlines is entertainment?" He stepped even closer to Kimmel's desk, his presence now completely dominating the space. The host actually leaned back in his chair, clearly intimidated by the raw power of Washington's anger. "I've watched you for years, sitting behind this desk like some kind of judge and jury, deciding who deserves respect and who doesn't. Well, let me tell you something about respect, Jimmy. You can't demand it, you can't fake it, and you certainly can't buy it with cheap laughs and manufactured controversy." Kimmel tried one last desperate attempt to regain control of his own show. Okay, I think maybe we should take a commercial break and just—" "No!" Washington's voice cut through the studio like a whip crack. "We're not taking a break. We're not cutting away. For once in your miserable career, you're going to sit there and listen to someone tell you the truth about who you really are." The audience was now completely silent, many of them looking genuinely frightened by the intensity of the confrontation. This had gone far beyond anything they'd expected when they'd come to see a late-night talk show taping. "You want to know what you are, Jimmy?" Washington continued, his voice dropping back to that dangerous quiet tone. "You're a coward. You're a coward who hides behind writers and laugh tracks and the safety of your little desk, taking shots at people who have the courage to put themselves out there and actually create something meaningful." Kimmel's hands were visibly shaking now as he gripped the edge of his desk. His usual smugness had completely evaporated, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. The man who had spent years making others squirm was now experiencing what it felt like to be on the receiving end. And the worst part, Washington said, leaning forward until he was almost nose to nose with the terrified host, is that deep down, you know I'm right. You know that everything I've said tonight is the truth you've been running from your entire career. The studio had become a powder keg, and everyone could sense that they were moments away from a complete explosion. What Washington said next would be the match that finally set everything ablaze. You know what the saddest part about all of this is, Jimmy? Washington's voice was now ice cold, each word precisely delivered like bullets from a gun. It's that somewhere along the way, you forgot that the people you mock, the careers you joke about, the dignity you destroy for laughs, those belong to real human beings with real feelings and real families who have to watch you tear them apart night after night. Kimmel's face had gone completely white. His hands were trembling so badly that he had to grip his desk to keep them steady. The cocky, arrogant host who had started this interview was nowhere to be found, replaced by a man who looked like he wanted nothing more than to disappear. I was just, Kimmel stammered, but Washington cut him off with a look that could have melted steel. You were just what? Just doing your job? Just being funny? Just giving people what they want? Washington's voice rose with each question, his anger finally unleashing in its full fury. No, Jimmy, what you were doing was feeding your own insecurities, by making sure everyone else felt as small as you do inside. The audience was now completely transfixed, watching the systematic destruction of their host's ego in real time. Many of them had their phones out, recording what would undoubtedly become the most viral moment in late-night television history. Kimmel made one final, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Look, Denzel, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. How about we start over? Clean slate? The laugh that escaped from Washington was cold and bitter. Start over? Clean slate? Jimmy, you don't get a clean slate when you've spent years building your career on other people's pain. You don't get to just reset when your cruelty finally catches up with you. Washington began moving toward the edge of the interview area, but he wasn't finished. Not yet. The final blow was still coming, and everyone in that studio could feel it building like a storm on the horizon. For 20 years, I've watched you from a distance, telling myself that what you do doesn't matter, that it's just entertainment, just harmless fun. But tonight, sitting here, listening to you try to diminish me the same way you've diminished countless others, I finally understand what you really are. He turned back to face Kimmel directly, his eyes blazing with righteous fury. You're a parasite, Jimmy. You feed off other people's accomplishments, other people's failures, other people's humanity, because you don't have enough of your own to sustain a real career. Kimmel's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The man who made his living with words had been rendered completely speechless by the devastating accuracy of Washington's assessment. And the worst part, Washington continued, his voice building to a crescendo that filled every corner of the studio, is that you've convinced yourself that tearing others down makes you important, that being cruel makes you clever, that destroying dignity is the same thing as creating comedy. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the band members had stopped pretending to look busy with their instruments. The entire studio was focused on the two men at the center of this unprecedented confrontation. Then Kimmel made his final, fatal mistake. Perhaps it was desperation. Perhaps it was one last pathetic attempt to regain control. But whatever it was, it sealed his fate forever. You. Know what, Denzel? Kimmel's voice cracked as he spoke. Maybe you're right. Maybe I am all those things. But at least I'm not a washed-up has-been clinging to past glory while the world moves on without him. The words hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds. Then Washington exploded. Fuck you, Jimmy. The words erupted from Washington with such force that several audience members actually jumped in their seats. "Fuck you and your pathetic, miserable excuse for a career." The studio erupted into chaos. Audience members gasped, producers screamed into their headsets, and camera operators frantically tried to decide whether to keep filming or cut away. But Washington wasn't done. "You want to call me washed up? You want to say I'm clinging to past glory?" Washington's voice boomed across the studio, drowning out all other sound. "I've built something real, Jimmy. I've created art that will outlive both of us. What have you created besides misery and cheap laughs at other people's expense?" He ripped off his wireless microphone and threw it down on Kimmel's desk with such force that it bounced and clattered to the floor. The sound echoed through the silent studio like a gunshot. "This interview is over," Washington declared, his voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. "And if you had any decency left, your career would be over too." With that, Denzel Washington turned his back on Jimmy Kimmel and walked off the set with the dignity and power that had made him a legend. The audience watched in stunned silence as one of Hollywood's greatest actors disappeared into the wings, leaving behind a host whose credibility lay in ruins and a studio full of people who had just witnessed television history. Kimmel sat behind his desk, staring at the spot where Washington had been standing, his face a mask of shock and humiliation. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of his complete and utter defeat. As news of the confrontation spread across social media within minutes, one thing became crystal clear. This wasn't just the end of an interview. This was the moment when Jimmy Kimmel's reign of cruelty finally came crashing down, brought to an end by a man who refused to let dignity be sacrificed for cheap entertainment.